There are over 25,000 unique cards in Magic the Gathering, but how many are truly unplayable in the Commander format? This video, I want to talk about an artifact that is often overlooked and almost certainly underplayed, Immovable Rod. Immovable Rod is a 1-mana artifact that costs a single white mana. It reads, you may choose not to untap Immovable Rod during your untap step. Whenever Immovable Rod becomes untapped, venture into the dungeon. Pay 3 generic and 1 white mana and tap this artifact. For as long as Immovable Rod remains tapped, another target permanent loses all abilities and can't attack or block. Immovable Rod was actually created for a Commander precon in 2021. Called Dungeons of Death and led by the Commander Sephirus of the Hidden Ways, the deck focused heavily on the venture into the dungeon mechanic. For those who don't know, I'll briefly explain how dungeons work in Magic the Gathering. The first thing you need to know is that there are 3 main dungeons in the game: the Lost Mine of Phandelver, Dungeon of the Mad Mage, and the Tomb of Annihilation. When you cast a spell or activate an ability that tells you to venture into the dungeon, if you aren't currently in a dungeon, then you must select one of these 3 dungeon cards to explore by placing a marker on the first room of your chosen dungeon. You also immediately trigger the effect of that room. For example, let's say you cast Kick in the Door and choose to enter the Lost Mine of Phandelver. You'll then trigger the first room of this dungeon and immediately scry 1. If you're already in a dungeon when you activate or trigger a venture, you instead move on to the next room. You cannot choose a new dungeon until your current dungeon is fully explored. Going back to the Lost Mine of Phandelver, the second level of this dungeon lets you choose 2 options: either make a 1/1 goblin creature token or create a treasure token. After you complete a dungeon, you are free to select any dungeon, including the one you just completed, when you next venture into the dungeon. There's one final wrinkle to this already complex mechanic: the initiative. Introduced in the Battle for Baldur's Gate Commander set, the initiative adds a 4th dungeon, the Undercity. This dungeon functions similar to the other dungeons, except that you can only enter it by playing a card that specifically gives you the initiative. And that's because the initiative reads, whenever you take the initiative and at the beginning of your upkeep, venture into the Undercity. If it's not clear, the initiative is similar to the Monarch mechanic, in that once you gain it, you get to keep it until another player deals combat damage to you, venturing deeper into the Undercity each turn. It should be noted that if you're already in one of the 3 original dungeons, gaining the initiative will not move you to the Undercity, but instead let you move forward in your current dungeon as normal. While the venture mechanic is certainly unique, it is not exactly a fan favorite. In part because it requires additional game pieces, many players avoid the dungeons completely, and I suspect that's a big reason why so many people have overlooked Immovable Rod. I mean, unless you're running a deck specifically designed to take advantage of the dungeon, Immovable Rod is just unplayable, right? Well, I'm not so sure. In fact, I think Immovable Rod is actually pretty bad in a dedicated dungeon deck. Think about it. Paying 4 mana every turn cycle just to get 1 venture trigger is extremely slow. Most dungeon decks are built to run through a dungeon much faster than that, either by repeatedly blinking creatures with venture ETBs like Radiant Solar, or by repeatedly discarding and or sacrificing creatures with Sephirus of the Hidden Ways. In these decks, Immovable Rod probably doesn't make the cut unless you're keeping it just for flavor reasons. So the next question is, if Immovable Rod doesn't fit in a dedicated dungeon deck, what deck might actually want to play it? Are there any? Let's take another look at what this card is doing. Ignore the bit about the dungeon and instead just read that last ability. For as long as Immovable Rod remains tapped, another target permanent loses all abilities and can't attack or block. This targets any permanent, including planeswalkers, lands, artifacts, creatures, enchantments, literally everything. And then it's got those magic words. That permanent loses all abilities, mana abilities included. Is someone making 20 plus mana a turn with Cabal Coffers? Shut it down. Can't target someone's commander because of Lightning Greaves? No problem. Just turn their boots into a 2 mana do nothing. Is there a planeswalker getting close to ultimate? Not anymore. Someone drawing too many cards with Rhystic Study? Tap your Rod and tell them no, because this incredible card can even turn off a Rhystic Study. Now, most Commander players would agree that Generous Gift is one of the best removal spells in the format, because it can instantly answer any problematic permanent for just 3 mana. Immovable Rod actually lets you do a similar thing for just 1 more mana. And yes, it can be removed, which is a downside, but it can also be untapped and reused if another permanent becomes an even bigger problem. I do think that Generous Gift is overall better than Immovable Rod. But Immovable Rod only shows up in 5,000 decks on EDH Rec. That's basically nothing. In comparison, Generous Gift is listed in nearly 600,000 decks. So, is Generous Gift better? Sure. But is Generous Gift 100 times better than Immovable Rod? Honestly, I don't think so. While I do think any deck could add Immovable Rod as a flexible removal piece, there are 2 specific strategies I want to highlight that should seriously consider adding this card. First, we have decks that want to tap their stuff. There are several commanders in the format that have abilities that let you tap or untap permanents. Derevi, Imperial Tactician, is probably the most famous example of this. Even outside of a dedicated dungeon deck, if you have a way to repeatedly tap and untap Immovable Rod, you're going to get some real value as you move through the dungeon. Outside of Derevi, Belisarius Call, Caprocti Sunborn, and Glacian Powerstone Engineer are 3 more examples of commanders who naturally want artifacts to tap down and may be interested in Immovable Rod, as it can work to either fuel your primary engine or shut down a problematic permanent. Better yet, there are dozens of other cards that can tap down Immovable Rod for free value. Some of my favorites include Inspiring Statuary, Lodestone Mirror, Warden of the Inner Sky, Clock of Omens, Moonsnare Prototype, Maria, Scholar of Antiquity, Sahili, Filigree Master, Archway of Innovation, Urza, Lord High Artificer, Sunshot Militia, Shao Jun, Girapur Aethergrid, Necron Overlord, and Shimmer Dragon. Of course, these cards also synergize with any untap effect, of which there are plenty. Seedborn Muse, Drum Bellower, Unwinding Clock, Apheto Alchemist, Kiyora's Follower, Kelpie Guide, Fate Stitcher, Dramatic Reversal, and Unbender Tine, just to name a few. I also mentioned Clock of Omens earlier, and it fits in this category as well, functionally tapping and untapping Immovable Rod for every artifact you control, and letting you run through dungeons like you really were a dedicated dungeon deck. Now you might be wondering, are there any other artifacts that like to be tapped down? Well, if you're a total degenerate like myself, then look no further than stacks. Many old artifacts have constant effects that are only active while they are untapped. Winter Orb and Static Orb are particularly brutal in any deck where you can leave them untapped on your opponent's turns, and then tap them right before your turn to completely dodge their negative effects. Howling Mine and Blinkmoth Urn also work this way, only they won't make your friends hate you. Some other friendly artifacts that like to be tapped down include Key to the City and Scaretiller. Moving on, there's one more strategy that can really take advantage of Immovable Rod: decks built to abuse activated abilities. Holding up 4 mana to use Immovable Rod as removal is pretty steep, but cards like Zerta the Dawnwaker, which can be your commander or your companion, and Dynahair Invoker Adept make Immovable Rod's already potent removal effect even stronger. Zerta by reducing the ability cost from 4 mana to 2, and Dynahair by copying Immovable Rod's ability to shut down 2 permanents at once. And yet, almost none of these decks are using Immovable Rod according to EDH Rec. While there aren't any other cards that actually reduce the ability cost of artifacts like Zerta the Dawnwaker, Power Stone tokens can be used to a similar effect. Cards like Great Desert Prospector can easily create 3 or more Power Stone tokens, which can pay for ability costs and make it much easier to hold up mana specifically for abilities like Immovable Rod. The Mana Rig, Karn Living Legacy, and Geology Enthusiast are 3 other Power Stone generators that could similarly work within an activated ability themed deck. I'll also mention Val Candlekeep Sage as an interesting commander option that can produce a ton of colorless mana. Paired with Noble Heritage, Val makes 5 colorless mana the first turn she hits the field, assuming she has haste. Moving on, cards like Lithoform Engine, Rings of Brighthearth, Adric Mathematical Genius, and Eartha Joe Frontier Mentor let you double up your Immovable Rod activations, shutting down 2 or more permanents with a single tap. Like Dynahair from earlier, Adric and Eartha Joe can also be your commander. Sadly, the numbers for these two commanders don't look any better. Accounting for each partner pair for Adric Mathematical Genius, I currently see 0 decks running Immovable Rod on EDH Rec. Eartha Joe is barely better with just 13 out of 414 decks. One quick side note, Eartha Joe only copies abilities that target a creature or player, making her ability slightly more narrow than other options. Alright, now that we've covered several reasons why Immovable Rod is underrated, and even talked about a couple strategies that can really take advantage of its effect, let's go back to the original question. Is Immovable Rod actually unplayable in the Commander format? Absolutely not. In fact, it might be the most playable card I've featured on my channel so far. I give Immovable Rod 6 dumpsters out of 7, a card so good that you could almost put it in any deck. But what do you think of Immovable Rod? Am I overrating its effects? Do you hate the artwork? Are you currently stuck in place because someone activated an Immovable Rod while you weren't looking? Let me know in the comments below, and please provide any suggestions for cards you want me to review in the future. And as always, please like and subscribe to help my channel grow.